So, yeah, I'm the grugq, as Tommy was saying. And I remember back in 2004 when I came here, and they didn't mention it was a 2-hour speaking slot. So I had my 1-hour presentation already, and I went through that, and everyone's sitting there, and I was like, "Are there any questions?" And they're like, "Yes." Like, "What's the next hour?" And I'm like, "Ah, it's good that you bring it up." Yeah, so during the coffee break, I went out and I wrote another 30 minutes of slides and managed to do almost the full 2 hours, but I felt pretty bad about that. And then I remember there was a huge number of military people there, but they weren't in uniform. And at the lunch, like, I was the only person who didn't completely clean my plate. And then if you look down, all of the knives and forks were at the exact same angle. But I guess in Anglosphere, you put it the other way. So it's these completely clean plates, and then mine with stuff all over it, and fork going the wrong way. So that was fun. And yeah, it's wild coming back after 20 years, and it's still T2. So what I want to talk about is basically how not so much hacking without hacking, but sort of what the actual spirit, what the point of hacking is, what true hacking is about, and how we can continue to hack even after if memory corruption goes away, or if any sort of specific technique goes away, sort of what the future is, because computers are becoming much more integrated into everything. Right? Cyber is now just part of life. If you want to get groceries, you're using a computer. Right? It's your phone that's using other computers. If you want to get a taxi, it's a computer. Right? All of these things are just integrated into society. And the way that they're done is through systems. And if you start thinking about hacking in terms of going after systems rather than going after computers, then it becomes a lot more powerful. Okay, so even though I have updated my slides, I never remember to update the agenda. So this may or may not accurately reflect what we're going to be doing. But we're going to begin, and we're going to end, and there's going to be stuff in the middle. So it's pretty accurate, sort of at the broad strokes, if you think about it. Don't think about it too much, though. But to start with, I want to go with this little story time thing. So you all remember the Yandex hack from September 1st of 2022? Don't need to go into details? Good. Okay, so this was Moscow in the morning of September 1st, 2022. And yes, it's fucking playing. Awesome. So this is what it looked like. And this was a hack, right? Someone hacked Yandex. So Yandex is the Russian version of Uber, which I don't know what the Finnish version of Uber is, but it's the Russian. Okay, so there you go. It's the Russian version of the Finnish Uber. And what happened is someone associated with the pro-Ukrainian side gained access to Yandex in some way. Now, it was either through creating hundreds of fake accounts, or they hacked the system and were able to generate fake accounts on there. This is the point. That's irrelevant. That doesn't matter, right? The way that they actually did it is not the point, because that's not what they hacked, right? That was not the hack. Instead, what happened was, once they had all of these accounts, they basically said, I want to get picked up at this one location and taken somewhere. And they sent out this request hundreds and hundreds of times. So every taxi went and said, yes, I will go and pick up the fare, and I will take them to that location. So all of them were going to the exact same place to pick up the fare. Right? And so it ended up causing this huge traffic jam for hours and hours and hours. And Like anonymous claim credit, but that's kind of meaningless. Now, here's the thing I found sort of interesting. The discourse around this is, well, at the time, it was wrong. I think it was, they didn't really understand what was going on. They had this very, very myopic view of what's going on. So you get all this stuff where it's like, oh, you know, like, this doesn't count because really it's not a hack. All they did was X, right? Like, it's not a hack. And you get like, blah, 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 blah. It's not hacked. You know, it's just like they created a bunch of accounts and they ordered taxis and then all the taxis showed up and everything got broken. And like, that doesn't count. That's not a real hack. And it's like, it was using the system maliciously, not hacking it, right? That's not really the same thing. And then, you know, it's not even a hack. It's more of a DDoS, right? So like, it's not hacked. They just DDoSed it. They DDoSed a road, which, you know, like, that's not even a computer. That doesn't count. And like, I have some issues with that. Like, a couple of things I want to bring up. Essentially, the point is, the hacking part wasn't about hacking the Yandex computers, right? That was just the mechanism that they used to hack the Yandex system, right? There's a system that exists that allocates taxis to fares and gets them from point A to point B, right? That is the system. That is what was hacked, right? Because it's not just this taxis from A to B. There are rules that taxis have to follow to participate in the system. And that's sort of the beauty of the whole thing, is that they took this completely useless capability, right? This sort of like lead exploit, where you can make a fake request for a fare, right? Which is boring and useless. Like, who cares? You can request any taxi from any point A to any point B. But through the magic of alchemy, they turn this lead into gold, where you take every taxi, right? So you can request any taxi to any location, or you request all the taxis to one location, right? And that is the sort of alchemy that they managed to do. They took this like boring, useless capability and they made it funny. And so this worked because the system that they were actually attacking included a bunch of rules that governed how the taxis operated. So the taxis, as you saw, can visibly see that there's hundreds of taxis going to the same place, not picking up a fare, right? They know it's broken and it's wrong. But the rules are, if you accept a fare, you cannot cancel the fare, right? Because they want a good user experience. So you can't like accept a fare, then go, oh, that's not far enough. I don't want that. It's not enough money. Cancel. Instead, what you have to do is you have to go to the location where the customer is, wait for 10 to 15 minutes so that the customer doesn't show up, and then the system will cancel the fare for you, and you don't get penalized. And so the system that was being hacked was actually this system. Like, this was the point of the hack, right? Drivers were not allowed to cancel. That's the point that was broken. That's the actual vulnerability, right? The requesting the fares, that wasn't the vulnerability. It was this. And this is a social technological rule, like it's socio-techno. It's a rule that was imposed on the drivers that they had to follow. And they could have chose to cancel and taken the penalty, but why would they do that, right? So this was the system that's getting hacked. And I think as we go like forward with the way that computers are integrating into society, there'll be a lot more instances of this than of just pure cyber stuff, right? This is where we're going to be seeing like the much more interesting interactions between hacking and like actual effects, right? So, very, very briefly, I'm going to talk about what systems actually are. And it's super brief because they're like, it's not complicated. I mean, they're complicated in how they operate, but describing them is very, very easy. So, a system is an interconnected set of elements that does something. That's it, right? And now, the elements don't have to be physical, right? It could be intangibles. The important thing is that they're interconnected and they have some sort of purpose. And the important thing is actually the purpose of the system is what it does. So you could say, like, this is a system to get people from point A to point B. But if what it does is just cause traffic jams, then that's the point of the system. Right? Like, it doesn't matter what you say, it matters what it does. But anyway, these are the key things. It's not all that important because, again, like, it's these things. The interconnections are important. The fact that there's elements that don't have to be tangible physical things, and it has some sort of purpose. It does something. That's it. Systems are very easy. But here's the thing, right? Complex systems have unexpected behavior. And that's where things get interesting, because all of these complex systems are the sort of things that we want to interact with and hack. So it's important to think about, like, how can you manipulate a system to achieve an outcome? And it might be that the outcome is just, I want to fuck with the system. Like, I want it to disintegrate or fail to function in some way. And because systems are so complex, it's actually relatively trivial to find a way to achieve that, because, like, all of these unexpected states are unexpected, sort of axiomatically. Right. Now, very, very logically, from here, we're going to be talking about some of the ways that systems function. And there's a lot of sort of basic rules about systems, but essentially, the system has to perceive the world in some way, right? And that's sort of like, that makes objective, normal sense. But then it leads to weird things, like if the system didn't see it, it didn't happen, right? So things only exist within the system if they can be perceived by the system. So for example, with the Yandex hack, it cannot perceive that it's being attacked and that there are, all of these fake fares at the same place. Like, that was not a thing that it was aware of. So that didn't happen. Right? As far as it was concerned, that didn't exist. Conversely, if the system did see it, it did happen. Right? So if the system saw that there were 100 people all requesting a fare, that's reality, that's the truth. There are 100 people all requesting a fare. Right? So the system sees reality as it's presented to itself from its sensory organs. And that is the reality that matters. And that gets very powerful if you think about it, because a lot of the time, that's computers. Like, that's where we operate. So you're able to, like, manipulate the reality of the systems. Which leads us to, like, a system is only as good as its sensory organs, obviously. Some examples of this. This guy got a facial recognition system and wanted to see sort of how good it was at determining, like, age and gender. And you can see it's pretty accurate with only minor variations. It can detect almost anything, even an 8-year-old male. Right? And so, like, this is the sort of quality of thing that you're dealing with. This is the sensory organs are just, they're not that great. So how can you exploit that? Well, easily and not so easily, it depends. The important thing about systems is that because they exhibit this complex behavior and they're sort of like emergent and they sort of do their own thing, you only figure out what you needed to know after you needed to know it. Right? So something will break and it'll be completely unexpected. But then when you look back at it and you'll go, how could that ever have worked? Like, why wasn't that immediately obvious, right? So some examples of that are recent examples of the lunar lander. So there was an Israeli one a while ago where, due to some like cosmic radiation errors, the computer had to reboot. And this was during the descent phase. And while it was rebooting, all of the thrusters stopped firing because the computer was rebooting. It turned out that you need your thrusters to be firing when you're descending. Otherwise, you slam into the regolith at hundreds of kilometers an hour. So that was a problem. But obviously, I mean, you would think, yeah, like if you're during the descent phase, you shouldn't stop just because the computer isn't on. Like, everyone knows that. So it's easy in retrospect. Or India had one where it got like massively, it was jostled outside of the parameters that it was set. Like it wasn't supposed to get thrown around this much. When it was, it sort of just ignored that it happened at all because it was outside the parameters. And it ended up being upside down. And so then when it figured out where it figured out it was 12 kilometers below the surface, and it just dropped. And then Japan did one where they changed the landing location, but they didn't retest the software. And so what happened was it had all of these things in place, so it could accept that some sensors would fail. And as it was coming down, it went over a cliff face that was like 3 kilometers tall. So the radar that was detecting the ground suddenly failed. It went from saying, like you're 2 kilometers up to you're 5 kilometers up. Clearly it's broken. So it started ignoring the radar and switched over to inertial guidance. And it ended up just hovering in the air and running out of fuel and then falling to the ground. And in retrospect, all of these are very simple and obvious, right? Because that's just kind of how it is, but you don't know it beforehand. That's the problem, right? You discover these sort of things by accident after it's too late. So that's kind of, like, that's the core of it. And that's sort of why, as someone attacking systems, you can always succeed. And it's because if you can figure out something that hasn't been anticipated beforehand, you're pretty much guaranteed to succeed because it hasn't been anticipated, right? So, like, it's pretty obvious if you think about it that taxis should not have 200 fares all at the exact same location. Like, that seems really simple. But to the people developing the system, obviously that was not the case, right? That's pretty much the mentality to have going into these things, is to look for ways that the system will not be able to respond correctly, that you can bypass the sensory organs, that you can create a version of reality that does not match with what's actually happening. So yeah, like it's easy to see the problems afterwards. Of course, the difficulty is that like making predictions is difficult, particularly about the future. So like, let's talk about another system. So if you want to look at how to exploit OpenSSH, you could spend a lot of time looking at the source code, or you could look at the OpenSSH system, right? Like, because it turns out that on distros, it's not just the OpenSSH daemon by itself. There's a whole bunch of other stuff going on, which means you can locate a weak point in the system and attack only that, right? And the system's vulnerability here was obviously OpenSSH links to systemd notify. Systemd is linked to libLZMA, and libLZMA is maintained by one person, right? So if you're looking at the OpenSSH system, what you end up with is, here's your vulnerability. Like, here's the thing you want to go after. And so someone, not naming any names, could be literally anyone in the largest country in the world, they managed to find a way to exploit the open source software system, right? And people, people looking at this XZ example, they've been going on a lot about like the specific problems that were exploited. But if you look at what was actually done, essentially they put someone into the project who contributed meaningfully and like practically for 3 years, right? This was someone who was doing huge amounts of actual work. They were building rapport, right? They were friendly, they were helpful, they were, answering questions. They were doing the scut work that no one wants to do, right? Like the very first major patch that got accepted was one for like ARM64, like multiplication or something like that, where it had been submitted and the maintainer goes, I'd love to add this, but the documentation needs to be updated. The variable names are wrong. This is not like the indentation format that we use, like some of these blah, blah, blah. There's just like a whole bunch of boring stuff. And the SVR, Jiatan, shows up and is like, hey, happy to help. How's everyone going? So I did all the documentation. I've updated the thing. I did this on the patch, blah, 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 blah. Hope that helps, right? Like, they were just super helpful. They were useful. They were nice. That's going to work on any project anywhere, right? Like, no one is going to like turn that sort of person away. Then they they did this sort of intelligence operation thing where you create a problem and then you allow someone to discover the solution that you've set up for them, right? So they put on a lot of pressure about things aren't getting updated fast enough, the maintainer is not doing enough, blah, 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 blah. And the maintainer is like, gee, if only I knew someone who was really helpful and doing a lot of work and happened to be available. And wait a minute, I know just the guy, right? And that was it. And the thing is, that can happen to anyone, and it will happen to anyone. And that's kind of because it's systems all the way down, right? All of it is systems. It doesn't matter which level you're trying to attack, there's systems involved, which is kind of the beauty of systems. And now we start to get to some kind of interesting things as well. So a lot of the internet is actually private systems, right? Like these are systems that are not controlled or maintained by the government, which in reality means all of cyber is controlled by companies, which is kind of obvious if you think about it, but it's also kind of interesting because private companies literally own all of the physical infrastructure, right? They own the digital infrastructure. They control everything about cyber, which means corporate policies control the physics of cyber. Like the domain in which cyber is conducted is entirely subject to the whims of a board somewhere in California making decisions. So in 2016, when the Russians took advantage of the way that Facebook was operating, that was a policy that Facebook had, that those were a set of policies that allowed that to happen. When they changed that in 2017, they literally impacted the ability of the Russian intelligence services to operate with policy decisions, right? A board made a number of decisions, and across the world, an intelligence agency had to adapt. That's kind of powerful, right? Like, we don't necessarily think about the level of control over the actual space that these corporations have. So one reasonably recent example. So out of pure malicious spite, on February 24th, the Ukrainian telcos severed all connections to Russian telcos. It means that, and this was like the first time in history that telcos could not route to each other for some reason. You know? And that actually ended up causing a huge amount of problems for the Russians. But essentially, by severing this access, it was no longer possible to make a phone call between Ukraine and Russia. And then they moved that to SMS as well, and internet routing. And so it, like there was, prior to this, there was a group doing a lot of SS7 hacking into Ukraine. They had to adjust their routes so that they would go from, rather than direct. Like these policies altered the environment, the cyber environment that things were happening in. But that had a real-world impact because for the Russians to operate, they needed a way to communicate. And like pretty much everyone else at the time, they were all just using cell phones. And that turned out to be very useful because now you could look for clusters of phones showing up. They're called spring flowers. And when they would show up on the network, then the Ukrainians would bomb the fuck out of them, right? And that was due to a policy that was enacted that created the space that the Russians had to operate in, which then gave the Ukrainians visibility into what was happening. For a while, what the Russians were doing was that they were getting local Ukrainians to basically purchase these huge SIM boxes, there's like 256 SIMs or whatever, and then they'd do VoIP calls into a local machine, and then through that SIM box, they would then do local calls out over the mobile network. And so the first time this happened, like the SBU shows up and they shut it down, we've caught a traitor, blah, blah, blah. The second time this happens, they didn't make it public, right? Because they figured out it's actually a good thing when the Russians are using our infrastructure to discuss their secret operations. That's good for us. And again, that's due to a policy decision that got made, right? The policy altered the cyber environment, which caused the physical environment to change in a way that was advantageous to the Ukrainians. So, the physics of cyber is literally determined by shareholder value, right? It is up to people maximizing shareholder value, shaping the way that the cyber environment operates, which is a little bit scary, right? That doesn't seem like how we should be running the internet, right? You'd think that cyber is too important to just leave it up to a few private companies and some rich fuckheads to make these sort of decisions. So anyway, here's a sort of famous quote from Brian Snow at the NSA, where he was like, I'm here to tell you that your cyber systems continue to function and serve you, not due to the expertise of your security staff, but solely due to the sufferance of your opponents. Right? Which is it's a pretty good point, right? You're safe just because no one cares enough to go after you. But I think it's worth turning that around and saying, I'm here to tell you that your cyber espionage continues to function not due to the expertise of your intelligence staff, but solely due to the sufferance of Meta, Amazon, Microsoft, Alphabet, Apple, etc. Right? They are operating in the same physical environment, in the same environment that is controlled by the shareholders of these companies. And so, if these guys wanted to, they could seriously impact the ability of the intelligence agencies to operate. But that's expensive, so why bother? Okay, so clearly this has been almost an hour. Once again, I am bang on target, hitting the timestamps perfectly. I wanted to talk about another place where we have this interface that's starting to happen between cyber and reality. And that's it's showing up with robotaxis, but there's a lot more like robo stuff, where there's these machines that are being programmed, put together, and sent out to operate in human spaces. And these machines are programmed by the same idiots who program all the other stuff that breaks all the time, which is a very scary thought if you think about it. Right? So robotaxis essentially are like these autonomous multi-ton vehicles traveling at dozens of kilometers an hour in the same spaces that we are. And that's not great, because these things are pretty dumb. Let's see. So you can see here there's a Tesla that's being attacked by traffic lights. And you think, what sort of condition would, oh right, there's a truck. Right. So that's not so great. Here we've got a food delivery vehicle that's encountering a crime scene. And obviously it is pretty excited to find that it can just go straight across the road because there's nothing in the way. That's great. Right. So, again, this is like the important variables are discovered by accident. It turns out that you actually do need to program crime scenes into food delivery. Who'd have thought? Here we have a confusing situation where a cop has pulled over a driverless vehicle, and no one's really sure what to do, but obviously it's all over now, and there we go. Right? So, all right. So that's the quality of stuff that we're dealing with, and it's not great, right? So this is there's an article that just went over like all of the things that was wrong with these. So like they don't recognize crime scene tape. So there was one that was driving and a bunch of power lines had gone down. And so there was tape up saying like, don't go in the road, there's power lines down. It didn't see the tape because no one had programmed it to. It drove through, the power lines got caught on it, and so it was then driving around with these power lines sparking all along behind it while it was like still going through the thing. And again, that's not great. It's like when they freak out, they stop. Like when they don't know what's going on, like the default thing is to just stop. So in front of like these firehouses, they got freaked out, and so they just stopped so that the fire trucks couldn't get out. And then you couldn't get rid of them because they were still freaked out. Like they're just like, oh my God, there's like sirens. I have to pull over to the side. And again, not great. Sometimes they'll go the wrong way down a one-way street and then suddenly realize they're doing the wrong thing and stop and like just stay there. This is a good one. They pulled up right behind a fire truck and parked so that the fire guys couldn't get their hoses out of the back because there's a car in the way. They parked on top of a fire hose. They are not good at dealing with exceptional circumstances, such as things that happen in the real world. And so people don't really like them. And one of the things that they've started to do is it turns out if you put a traffic cone on the hood, the car has to wait until someone comes and takes it off. Otherwise, it just stays there because it doesn't know how to respond. This started out as like a meme, and people hate them, so it happens all the time. And these are systems that are just encountering slightly exceptional circumstances, and they stop operating, right? Because, they can see something's wrong, but they don't really know what. And that kind of leads smoothly into complex systems fail in complex ways. So when you have something like an autonomous vehicle, there's a lot going on, right? Like it has to understand huge amounts of real-world things in order for it to operate properly. Like, what do you do when you get pulled over? Well, you wait until the human is no longer in a danger zone, and then you drive off, like you leave, you know? Or you stop when you see a fire truck, even if you happen to be right behind it and parking on the fire hose. Like, that's just how these things end up behaving. And that's kind of because reality is more complex than it seems, right? Every time you try and model something, it turns out that you can always just do it a little bit better. And this comes from, there's an article in 1984 about these guys who were doing computer modeling, like 3D modeling. And they started out modeling a coffee cup. It sounds pretty easy, right? It's basically a cylinder, it's got sealed on one end and like part of a hoop. It's like, well, I mean, yeah, but that's not really a coffee cup. Like a coffee cup has more dimensionality. So you had like some width and like a lip and like it's, you know, concave on the bottom and convex on the, and I mean, that's kind of right, but it's still, it's not exactly a coffee cup, right? You have to add like just a little bit more every time. And that's because like reality is basically infinitely complex. Like every time you kind of have it, you can just go a little bit closer to reality and be like, okay, well, I need to add some more granularity. Which leads us with like, reality is more complex than it seems. So like it seems pretty straightforward to have a driverless vehicle, right? You take the rules of the road, you add some cameras, you add some like radars to see where things are, boom, you're done. And it's like, well, except the rules of the road are sort of suggestions. They're not like how the world actually works, right? Which sort of leads us to the other thing. Systems don't adapt to people. Right? You get what you get, and you have to sort of figure out how to live with it. And, you know, like there's a whole bunch of stuff with systems, right? So like, systems are easier to put up than they are to take down, right? Temporary solutions aren't, you know? But yeah, like this is the thing, is that systems do not adapt to people. People adapt to systems, right? So, for example, in California, there's a 2-lane road where, for some reason, a food delivery vehicle believes that there's a crossing, like a pedestrian way crossing. And so it tends to just shoot out in the middle of this highway. And there haven't been any accidents yet, but like, you know, you're basically driving along, and then between two parked cars, this robot shoots out in front of you. Now, there's a couple of ways that this could be solved. One way is that we find the people who have programmed the map software that's being used. We get them to update their map to recognize that there's no pedestrian crossing, to push that map update out to all of the vehicles, or to all of these little robots, and make sure that they now have the latest version. Or we could put up a sign that says, slow robot crossing. Like, which one do you think is going to happen? All right. So that's it. That's basically, that's what I've got on systems. Are there any questions? Please have at least 30 minutes of questions.
What are your thoughts? The United States Security and Exchange Commission now has new regulations holding the board of directors accountable for cybersecurity. What are your thoughts of ethical hackers working together to hold the senior management of these companies?
Slowly.
So the United States Security and Exchange Commission has a new requirement that's, or law that's holding the senior management and the board of directors of these public corporations accountable for cybersecurity and cyber events. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts of ethical, honest, good-intentioned human beings who are ethical hackers to help keep these board of directors and decision makers at these large corporations fully accountable under that law?
I'm going to be cynical, and I'm going to say it's probably as likely as any law holding companies accountable. I don't have a lot of hope for that. One would like to think that they approach this in good faith and try and follow through, but I mean, just recently there's been a bunch of stuff on how Microsoft is, they've done a lot of backsliding on their security. And so for a little while, they were actually investing in it and taking it seriously, putting a lot of money into it. And then it seems that they had a change of heart, and now it's just not a priority anymore, and they're dicking around and charging people. They view security as like it could be a revenue center. We could just charge people money for security, and that's caused problems, like actual national security problems, where Russia and China are able to penetrate systems that are being used by the government and gain access to emails and so on. And that sort of gets to happen because of the amount of lobbying that's being done by Microsoft to keep themselves from being held accountable. Right? Like they spend so much effort on making sure that everyone knows we should still be saying responsible disclosure, and that we should still be, it should be up to the vendor to decide when to release the patch and when to release information about a vulnerability. And the vendors should, I think at one point they were pushing to have a rule that said no one is allowed to make exploits for commercial operating systems. Like, that should be a thing, right? Like, no one can exploit anything that you have to pay money for, and it's a little bit self-serving if you think about it. Like it's not actually going to make the internet any safer if the U.S. government is not allowed to have exploits for Windows, but because that's where they put their lobbying, like I fully believe that that's like any law that's in place that would restrict the ability for companies to do whatever the fuck they want, they're just going to lobby around it. So yeah, I would not be optimistic.
What would be your advice for engineers that are building systems? I find that the current abstraction levels in software means that nobody actually understands the system that they're actually designing. So what's the methods for actually understanding your system that you're building?
That's an excellent question, and I'm glad that you've asked. Next question. Yeah. Now, I'm afraid I don't really know how to get people to do systems understanding. There's good books on systems thinking, sort of how to, thinking about systems is different than thinking about a software architecture, for example. So a lot of the time when you're thinking about systems, what you're doing is you're thinking about the information flows, and then it's like there's specific jargon, like inputs and outputs. I'll slow down if I'm losing anyone here. I can understand. It's a little bit technical, but like you have all these like concepts of basically like how fast does something go into a system? Does it like build up? And that's called like stock. So like if it builds up, then you have one sort of system. If it's always depleting, you have another sort of system. And if it's stable, you have a third sort of system. So that's basically all the systems you could possibly have. And so yeah, like there are ways of picturing and imagining this stuff, but it's not useful in terms of like, it's very useful if you want to be like, what is the legislation or like what policies should I have to adjust the demographics of my city, right? It's not particularly useful when it's like, how many microarchitectures should I support and like, which database should I be using? Right? Like it's a little bit less useful at that end. So I'm afraid I don't know. Like systems thinking stuff is not really, it's designed for policy people and like adjusting really big things, which are too complex to model accurately. So they just model it poorly and hope for the best. So yeah, sorry. Good luck. Best I can say. It's people like this that will keep the rest of us in a job. There will always be problems with systems, which is the fundamental nature. Oh, briefly, I would recommend the book Systemics, The Systems Bible by John Gall, Gall. It's kind of a joke book, but it's really not. It was written in the 70s, and then it was updated in the 80s, and it's super applicable. It's wonderful. I love it. Sorry.
I'll piggyback onto that question. In terms of offensive consultants being dropped into fields of technology that they aren't accustomed to, do you have any ideas or recommended material for how to make it so that them looking for vulnerabilities or complex failures doesn't become a guessing game? Because you said that most of these things are discovered by accident, which doesn't really serve the clients well.
No. The problem is because a lot of the time you're dealing with emergent behavior where it's hard to predict beforehand. So let's take the 737 MAX, right? The plane that kept crashing because it only had input from one sensor, right? Hands up everyone who designs, jumbo air carriers for a living. Yeah, hands up everyone who knows that you should have at least 2 sensors, right? So we all know what they did wrong, but beforehand, no one did, right? And that's the sort of fundamental problem that you're dealing with, is that when you show up, all of the assumptions that have gone into place to make this thing happen are just implicit assumptions. You just that's the way that reality works, right? And so when you're trying to find a way that they misjudged reality, it's hard to do that systematically.
So you're saying everything basically has to be based on experience and there's no substitute?
Yeah. Well, so this is one of the things is they did this study on intelligence analysts, people who can look at intelligence and try and figure out, make not necessarily predictions about the future, but can make accurate assessments about what's actually going on. And they wanted to say, what are the things that lead intelligence analysts to be good, right? Is it a particular methodology, right? Do they do Bayesian analysis or alternate competing hypothesis or red team, blue team, or, what is it that makes them good? And it turns out it's just experience, right? The guys that had 20 years, it didn't matter what methodology they used, they were better than the guys who had 5 years. And again, it didn't matter what methodology it was. So sometimes it turns out that it's just experience.
To continue with the same theme from different point of view, considering that AI, machine learning, automated response, etc., is hype at the moment, from my point of view, I think it's often a bad idea to have any kind of automated response to any kind of event happening, but at the same level, C-level stakeholders think it's a brilliant idea. How would you convince those kind of individuals understanding that the system doesn't function in a vacuum?
I swear a lot, so you can tell that I don't actually speak to C-levels very much. But I do absolutely agree with you. I think that AI is really good for certain things. If you happen to be an expert on something already, and you just don't want to deal with certain types of low-level, boring work, you can farm that out because you can sort of manage what's happening, right? And you can make sure that it's producing the right thing. I think there's a Twitter thread which was particularly good on it, which was that basically autonomous vehicles turn the experience of driving into being a driving instructor, right? So you go from controlling a vehicle and having a good time to just being terrified and watching someone else in control of your life. And I think that kind of captures it. It's sort of you understand code a lot better if you write it than if you read it. But if an AI takes away the writing of the code, fundamentally it means that people will understand it much more poorly. Like they will not understand it as well as if they wrote it themselves. So it's like axiomatically a bad thing. Like I find that the text that gets written by these things is just, it's awful. Like it flows very well, but it's not good. Like it doesn't really understand what's going on. They also all have like the same voice, and like all of the grammar rules that they apply so strictly means that there's no flavor, right? Like it's all very sterile because they like, if you say like this is very, very important, they'll be like, you only need one very. And it's like, no, I don't. Like I'm trying to, like it's called emphasis. You know, like it's not incorrect to, break grammar sometimes because you're trying to get something across. And like none of these systems do that properly. Like they don't know how to be human. They don't know how to like actually do things in a way that like, I don't know, it's not good. I think that they're great for like, if you write 300 words and you need it to be 150 words, and you just paste it and be like, make this concise. Sure, But if you just say, write a concise version of this thing, it's going to be garbage. So yeah, that does not answer your question at all, but moving right along. Systems.
Maybe now? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so I was just going to ask about the autonomous vehicles, that if you know there's an accident at some place, like the fire department knows that, or the police department knows, so couldn't you just like make a buffer zone around that and like reroute the vehicles? And if not, then like why not? Because it seems like a pretty obvious solution, but yeah.
I don't know. I don't work at these companies.
Okay.
I mean, the fundamental problem is that you're trying to create a system that can respond to a dynamic environment by reacting to like events around us, and you want it to be able to do that without having someone taking over, because then. What was it? It's like AI, it's like a lot of Indians, right? Like it ends up, so it ends up being like, yeah, it's AI, but basically all we do is we have a data center with like, 100,000 people monitoring stuff and taking over manually. Like it doesn't really count. Like Amazon had this like, a grocery store where you could basically like pick things up and it would detect that and charge you for it, so you could just walk out. And it turns out that like the AI that they were using was just Indians who were like monitoring CCTV, right? And humans are just good at doing things that computers aren't, and like reality is more complex than it seems. So it sounds like, yeah, why don't you just do this really basic, simple thing? And like that will work 99% of the time, and then it won't in like one edge case. And that'll be the one edge case where like it runs over a 3-year-old or something, So, excellent. Yeah.
Can I continue a little bit on that topic that we were just discussing? So, cost of compute is getting so low, and adding complexity these days doesn't really cost anything. So, do we really have any kind of hope for the future in trying to solve any of these issues?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, like I think it's really good at automating some things, but like there's a lot of rules about systems that start coming into effect. Like systems don't actually solve problems; they just shift problems, right? So the classic example goes with like if you have a small town and you want to deal with garbage, right? You could either have like everyone carry their garbage outside of the city and chuck it away somewhere, or you could get like garbage collection, and that solves one problem, but it introduces Now you have to deal with unions of garbage collectors. You have to deal with purchasing trucks. You have to do scheduling to figure out which days. You have to figure out how to deal with holidays. You have to figure out like the hours. And then the system is going to start kind of not doing what it was supposed to anymore. So the definition of garbage is going to become important. So they're going to say like, well, we won't pick up recycling. You have to separate your own recycling. So it goes from a system that collects garbage to now people have to sort all their garbage beforehand and only some of it gets collected and some of it doesn't. And then, well, they won't pick up yard waste, right? So you go from one problem, which was garbage, to now a load of problems, which is like introduced by the system. And I think that that's going to start happening, where you kind of solve one thing, like the paperless office. Some of us are old enough to remember, like, there was the idea that having computers would mean that we wouldn't have to deal with paper anymore. But it turns out that computers make generating paper so cheap and easy that we now have more paper than we ever had before, right? Like, it's the opposite. Like, this is the last thing we wanted to happen. Right, like systems oppose their own function. Like it seems to be going one way, and then it just goes the exact opposite. So that's what I assume is going to happen. I was like doing some consulting with people, and they had this idea for a system, and they explained like it's all going to work like this. And I was looking at it, I'm like, this is brilliant. But what happens if like reality is anyway slightly different than this assumes it's going to be, right? And I can't say how it's going to be different because like reality is reality. Like who knows what's going to go on? But as soon as anything comes up that breaks, like AI systems like don't know how to do things that they haven't been told how to do, and so it just won't work. And when that part doesn't work, like how's the rest of it going to fail over? And I mean that's what I assume is going to happen. And not that I can predict the future, but like based on prior trends, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, this is not working for me either.
It's like a USB key, at least 3 times.
Is this? Yeah, this is now the USB-C version. Not yet. About the systems hacking were all about trying to find the implicit or explicit rules about the whole working of the system. And I was thinking that, does this mean that we are going to, in the future, see much more of a, let's say, old school social engineering, where people like called helpless and whatever, because now social engineering has been quite a lot about like spam things and things like that.
Yeah. So like I think Lapsus is a wonderful example of this, right? So if anyone is not familiar with Lapsus, it was a bunch of teenagers who managed to get into like everywhere. And like some of their super secret elite hacking tricks was like they would pay $2,000 to a frontline help person for a username and password, which, I mean, like that's social engineering, but it's like, I mean, that's going to work always, right? If you've got someone who's being paid minimum wage, and then someone says like, I will give you 1 month's salary up front to do your job for me, they're going to do it, right? One of them, like, you like it, maybe not the first one that you talk to, but you're going to find someone who will. And like I've always thought it's a little bit interesting that the people who do like threat emulation and like we will behave like your adversaries and all that stuff, none of them are ever paying money to help desk people, right? Like that's what adversaries do. Like they just want to get in, and it's worth $2,000. Like you can build a client for that. It's not even out of your own pocket, right? Like that's an expense. So like. That's kind of how things, I think that's a lot of how things are going to start getting hacked. And for like those of us who grew up back when, when hacking was hacking and you had to walk uphill both ways and, like memory corruption was the only sort of corruption that counted, blah, blah, blah. It's a little bit disappointing that like things have gotten so much easier. and like it doesn't feel right. But it's also really interesting how kids these days are just so fucking creative with the things that they come up with, right? Like, personally, I would not have thought to just pay someone money for access. Like, it's super obvious, but beforehand, I would never be like, yeah, why don't we just buy it? Like, not on the black market, not like dark, deep web stuff, just like literally call up and be, would you like $5,000? Like, I will give you $5,000 right now if you give me a VPN login and password. Thank you. Right? Like, what the fuck? Yeah. So, yes, definitely.
Yeah. So
Sorry.
we can learn more from seeing people fail. So I managed to do it like in one shot, but that's because you helped me figure out how the mic works. So thanks for that. I'm not going to ask you to have a crystal ball and look into the future, but as a consultant, when you consult clients on what can go wrong with systems, can you speak to the practice of threat modeling and how you and how you see that as being useful in software design to actually look at the architecture before it is built to see what's going to go wrong with this?
Yeah. So. Obviously, it's a lot easier it's easier and cheaper to fix things at the beginning than at the end once it's been implemented, and like so many fundamentally basic things are just like timeless. So like the fundamentals of information security, least privilege, network segmentation, all of the basic stuff. So there's a paper from the 90s that lists all of these out, and it's got different names for things, but they're the exact same concepts. And like, if you look at I guarantee you that any report that you've written in the last however many years, that will say, here's the things you need to improve to, get your security up. It's going to be, you need to have, least privilege. You need to have, assumption of compromise. You need to have network segmentation. So like, all of those things still apply. And I think that because those are like fundamental rules of security, it doesn't really matter what the system is. When it fails, it's going to try and violate these rules. And if you've got those in place, then you're protected, right? So it's going to be like the same things that worked in the 90s and the 80s and the 70s. And like, they still work as long as you follow those ideas. But, do people do it in practice?
No, I find not. I'm a threat modeling consultant, and I see these things being violated. We know that things are going to go wrong. Like you said with the sensors, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Everybody knows you need 2 sensors. The person building the plane just didn't put them in.
Yeah.
That's how that works. Thanks.
Yeah.
Somebody turned it off.
Okay.
So I was thinking about assumptions and experience, and I'm trying to form this into a question that ends with a question mark. So I'll give it a go. You mentioned experience being a good driver, and I was just thinking that's probably just higher quality assumptions. But the problem seems to be that experience calcifies your assumptions to a way.
Yep.
Would you think that there's some kind of a method to break yourself out of that calcification of assumptions that we like to call experience?
Yeah. So one of the Buddhist things is cultivate beginner mind. So in the mind of an expert, few things are possible, and in the mind of a beginner, anything is possible. So it's sort of it's exactly what you're talking about. Like, once you know how things work, you can say, well, like, look, these are the 3 things that always work. I've tried the other stuff 20 years ago. It didn't work then. These things are guaranteed to work. But, stuff has changed in 20 years. And so, cultivate beginner mind. Like, go back to that, like, well, what are all the possibilities? Like, what if we just pay people money, right? Like, what if we just give them cash straight up front? Like, why do we need to buy this and that and then go and like spray and like blah, blah, blah? Well, like, just buy it, So yeah, like, That's it. It's the cultivate beginner mind, which, you know, it's a little bit useless, like most Buddhist things are, in that like you actually have to do stuff, but you know, you have to sort of interpret it and like figure out what's going on. You can't just apply straightforward stuff. But I think that's the approach to take, at least.
Yeah, I think one of the main problems with paying is paying your employees to betray you and then fire them is going to be legally problematic.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.